The 2021 NFL regular season concluded with an unbelievable game between the Chargers and the Raiders that presented us a scenario that we had never seen before. Both teams could qualify for the playoffs with a tie, but if either lost, they would be eliminated. Miraculously, the game found its way to overtime after the Chargers erased a 15-point deficit late in the fourth quarter, converting 6 fourth downs along the way. The teams exchanged field goals in overtime before the Raiders eventually won the game with a walk-off field goal. Now, many fascinating storylines emerged from this game, but the one that was most prominent was that a timeout taken by Brandon Staley late in the extra frame was to blame for the Chargers' ultimate demise. Now, was this a just placement of blame, or was it simply a false narrative perpetuated by those covering the game both during and after? That is the question that I, the CorOner, will tackle on this episode. Hey sports fans, welcome to the Command Center for another episode of Coach's CorOner with your host, Jeff the Sandman Suk. Welcome back. I have a unique show for you today. Today I'm just going to look at one game, and not just one game, but one sequence from one game, the aforementioned Chargers-Raiders regular season finale. The first thing I want to get into is to just revisit what the ramifications of the game were, so let's get into that right away. For the Chargers, it was pretty simple. Had they won the game or tied the game, they would be the 6th seed and head to Buffalo. They were eliminated with a loss. The Raiders had much more incentive to win this football game. With a win, they'd be the 5 seed and head to Cincinnati, play a Bengals organization that hadn't won a playoff game in 31 years. With a tie, they'd be the 7 seed, head to Arrowhead to play the Kansas City Chiefs, a team that not only thumped them twice in the regular season, but also is the 2-time defending AFC champion. Now, the Raiders would still be eliminated with a loss, so you don't really want to risk that. However, they would be greatly benefited by a win over a tie in this scenario. So we're going to start the sequence on second down for the Raiders. They're around midfield at 2nd and 11. There's a minute 20 left in overtime, and both teams have both of their timeouts. So this is a very productive play for the Raiders. They gain 7 yards here, setting up 3rd and 4, and it puts them into field goal range. So the Chargers, they don't call timeout right after the play. They let the clock wind down. And as it's winding down in between what would eventually lead to their timeout, Chris Collinsworth has this to say.
Of course. So you're taking a chance on not going to the playoffs. If you try a kick, could get blocked, anything could happen, right?
Right.
Whereas if you take a knee, the game's over and you're in the playoffs.
So what Collinsworth is alluding to in this clip is the possibility that the Raiders could have their field goal attempt blocked and return for a touchdown for the Chargers. So even if they were able to kill the clock to a point where there was, say, 3 seconds left, and it's either they make the field goal, they're the 5 seed, or they miss the field goal and they're the 7 seed, maybe they'd still be better off not even attempting this field goal, because if it got blocked and returned, they could be eliminated from the playoffs. Now, to me, this is completely ridiculous. The chances of having your field goal blocked and returned for a touchdown are about, 1 in 1,000, okay? Your win probability of winning in Cincinnati as opposed to winning in Kansas City. Now, we know now that the Bengals did beat the Raiders, so that was a very close game. I doubt it would have been that close in Arrowhead. We'll never know. It doesn't matter. The point is, they had, at this juncture in time, they had a lot of incentive to win the game, and there's no way a 1 in 1,000 chance of a field goal being blocked and returned for a touchdown was ever going to deter them, as long as they could take the field goal as time expired. The one thing that could deter them, though, is the threat of the Chargers getting the ball back and thus scoring and eliminated them, okay? So let's get to the actual timeout now. We're going to show the timeout, and then we're going to hear Collinsworth and Michael's reaction to it.
3rd and 4, now what? Chargers take a timeout.
What?
So if I'm commentating this game, the first thing I'm mentioning is that there's 5 seconds left on the play clock when the timeout is called, and thus the game clock is only marginally affected. That's the first thing I'm mentioning it. Instead, what do we get? We get, what? Like, great work, guys. Like, so, and at no point in the sequence do they ever bring up the fact that there's 5 seconds left on the play clock when the timeout is called. And on top of that, they never bring up the fact that the Raiders are motivated to win the game. They only mention that if it ends in a tie, both teams make the playoffs. These are two huge omissions. So let's go back to that play. Let's just take a look. This is the exact moment that Staley calls the timeout. And there you can see 5 seconds left on the play clock and 38 seconds left on the game clock. So what does that mean? Had he not called the timeout, the Raiders would have had to snap the football with about 34 seconds left on the game clock. As is now, after the timeout, they'll be snapping it with 38 seconds left on the game clock, but the Chargers will have one less timeout. That, in essence, is the only difference in the scenario. There's a lot more there to unravel, for sure. But before I do that, let's just revisit how the whole situation ended up playing out.
Jones goes in motion. Jacobs. And he's going to take a snap. Good. Hold good. And
the Raiders are able to pick up the first down by running the football, meaning they can chew up the remainder of the clock, kick a field goal as time expires, and advance to the playoffs as the 5 seed, sending the Chargers home and thus sparking the false narrative that somehow Brandon Staley's timeout was to blame for the Chargers' plight. So let's dig deeper into that right now. To me, the most fascinating element of this entire situation is to consider what would have happened had the Chargers forced a fourth down, because their optimal move would have been to call a timeout right away. You see, if the Chargers didn't call a timeout right away, then the Raiders would simply run the clock down. They're already in field goal range, and they would just attempt a long field goal as time expires with very little risk. However, if the Chargers call timeout right away, now they're putting the Raiders into a difficult spot, right? Because now the Raiders either have to, A, attempt a long field goal with about 30 seconds left on the clock and thus risk giving the Chargers the ball back near midfield, or B, punt the football back to the Chargers, all but locking in the tie. So, the best route for the Chargers to get a tie was to threaten the fact that they might try and win the game. So this is the before and after photos of the timeout. On the top you have it just as Staley is taking the timeout, and the bottom is just when the Raiders are snapping the ball coming out of the timeout. Now, we know that the Raiders ended up picking up the first down here, but to properly analyze whether or not the timeout was as catastrophic a blunder as many would have you believe, it's important to note how it altered the Chargers' position. So let's pretend that the Chargers forced the fourth down and took a timeout right away. On the top, if the Chargers didn't take the timeout, that would leave the game clock with around 30 seconds left, and the Chargers would have one timeout remaining. On the bottom, the game clock would be around 34 seconds left, and the Chargers would have no timeouts left. Which is more threatening to the Raiders? Well, I'd have to say that the Chargers would be slightly more threatening if they didn't take the timeout, but I also think that in either scenario, the Raiders would be forced to punt the ball and settle for the tie. We will never know, of course, and it would have been fascinating to see, but either way, the play was so important to the Chargers that if Staley saw something he didn't like, he was completely justified in taking a timeout in an attempt to correct it. As I mentioned earlier, Brandon Staley received an abundance of criticism for his decision to take a timeout at the end of that football game. And what I want to do now is I want to just go over what some of the so-called experts are saying about it as justification for why they believe the timeout was so detrimental. So let's start with our good buddy, Chris Collinsworth.
We'll never know, but I can't help but wonder if that timeout changed the mindset of Rich Bisaccia.
So this is probably the most popular argument out there for why this timeout is really bad. And it's just not a very strong argument because their mindset didn't change. There was no possible change to be made. Their mindset is pretty ABC before or after the timeout. This is their mindset. I'm going to tell it to you right now. We're going to run the football. Why are we going to run the ball? Because it's the safest route, and we've had great success doing it all day long. So we're going to run the football. If we get the first down, we're going to run the clock down and kick a field goal. If we don't get the first down, well, we're going to hope that the Chargers don't call a timeout. Then we're going to call a timeout with 3 seconds left and kick a field goal. And if the Chargers do call a timeout right away, we're probably going to punt the football. That's our mindset. That doesn't change. There's no difference before or after the timeout. The mindset's still the exact same. All right, okay, I got a little heated there. So what I did is I took a timeout for myself. And you know what? I hope that didn't change anyone's mindset out there. But speaking of mindsets, even if the timeout did change the Raiders' mindset, which I guess means that even if the Raiders got a first down before the timeout, if they got the first down, they would just let the clock run out, not even attempt the field goal, which is ridiculous. I guess that's what that means. Even if this timeout changed their mindset, which again, it didn't, that's not on Brandon Staley. You know, it's not Brandon Staley's fault the Raiders were so slow to pick up the obvious strategy in the situation. So that is a terrible argument. Let's go on to the next one. So the next one is actually Derek Carr's interview. I've heard this reference a lot. So let's hear it.
Could have ended in a tie. Chargers call a timeout. How did that shift the strategy?
Yeah, it definitely did, obviously. But we
Derek Carr is pretty jacked up in this interview, and so he should be. His team just won a huge game. It's one of the biggest wins of his career, if not the biggest win of his career. And he got asked a leading question. Didn't answer it at all, by the way. She asked how, not if. But somehow this became proof to the world that Staley's timeout was indeed detrimental, which, again, doesn't really make much sense to me. But let's go back to the photo and see how the strategy might have changed for the Raiders. Now, we know that on the bottom, the Raiders ended up running the football, but what were they going to do up top if the Chargers didn't call the timeout? Were they going to kneel down from shotgun with Renfro in motion? Were they going to punt with their quarterback? Were they going to run the Statue of Liberty? Hail Mary? No, they were going to run the football, the exact same thing they did. Sure, the formation is different, the play call is different, but the strategy is exactly the same. Derek Carr didn't explain how the strategy changed because there was no answer to that question. The strategy did not change. This one is my personal favorite. Let's take a look. Here we have Austin Eckler apparently being told by Raiders long snapper, yes, long snapper, Trent Sieg, that the Raiders were going to kneel. To me, it's really a shame that they didn't show who the equipment manager was talking to. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that conversation too. Well, you clearly weren't going to kneel on third down. And if it gets to fourth down and the Chargers call timeout, you're definitely not kneeling then. If you get the first down and all you want is the tie, well, you can just let the clock run out. You don't need to kneel. So I really don't see how the kneel was entering the conversation here.
Raiders are off to Cincinnati. They win in overtime, but it looked like they were playing for the tie until Brandon Staley, head coach of the Chargers, called a timeout. So Raiders, what were you thinking?
Right, so at this juncture, we move over to the NFL Network and tune into their coverage. And right away, we have Chris Rose perpetuating this nonsense and introducing Raiders head coach Rick Bisaccia. So we're going to hear what he had to say.
Yeah, it was conversation. We were talking about, I don't know if you know, we ran the ball there and they didn't call a timeout. So I think they were probably thinking the same thing, and then we had the big...
So right away, he mentions how the Chargers didn't call timeout, how they didn't try to stop the clock, displaying just how inconsequential he believes the one they actually did call is.
Then we had the big run to there, and we got the big run and got us, we thought it was advantageous field goal position for us. We were going to take the field goal and try to win it. But we're certainly talking about it on the sideline. We want to see if they were going to call a timeout or not on that run. They didn't, so we thought they were thinking the same thing. And then we popped the run in there and gave us a chance to kick the field goal to win it. So we're certainly talking about it.
Yeah, he mentions that the Raiders considered a tie. Of course they did. He mentions that the Chargers were clearly interested in a tie. Of course they were. He mentions how big an impact the run they had on third down had. Of course. None of these things are earth-shattering. None of these things indicate that he believes that Staley's timeout altered anything at all. And yet this is the reaction Chris Rose had to it.
Content to have a tie.
To borrow a line from Chris Collinsworth, what? At no point does he say he was content with a tie. He says they talked about a tie, they considered a tie, but at no point does he say he's content with a tie. That's a complete fabrication, and I just don't understand how you watch that interview and that's what you take away from it. And it's no wonder that this false narrative kept growing and growing with the way it was covered. And I'm going to get more to that in a minute, but first, let's take a look at what Brandon Staley himself had to say about the whole situation.
Derek Carr said after the game that timeout changed their mentality. Do you think that had any reason to do with them?
Actually, he never said anything like that at all, but whatever, carry on.
I think it changed their mindset because they were going to run the ball on the play before, and then they ran the ball the very next play. So we wanted to make sure that we got our run defense in there, and we obviously didn't execute well enough, but we wanted to get our premium one-back run defense in here, and that's what we did.
Yeah, that's a perfectly justifiable explanation for what transpired. You know, what cracks me up is to think about the sports writer out there that was watching that interview and said, nah, you know what? I don't buy it, Staley. I read the long snapper's lips. I know what's really going on here. And woke up the next day and wrote that Staley's timeout cost the Chargers their season. That makes me laugh, you know, because it's just so ridiculous. But before I pile on the media too much, I do want to give a shout out to Maurice Jones-Drew of the NFL Network. He was working alongside Chris Rose that night, and he was the one voice of reason throughout this whole nonsense. And this is what he had to say after the Staley interview.
Could have, but again, if they ran the ball, like he said, and they were trying to put their best run defense out there, you can't fault that man for trying to give us a chance to win the game or tie the game.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately for Brandon Staley and the Chargers, the timeout proved ineffective. And that's really the only remaining argument at this point, is that it was a bad timeout because it didn't work. You called it to stop the run and you didn't. But that's just really a purely results-oriented way of looking at it. And you could do that with, you know, every decision that's made in a football game. You know, every fourth down a team goes for, you could just say, hey, it was a good choice if they got it, or it was a bad choice if they didn't get it. But that's not the way we're going to do things around here. And in this instance, the timeout was fine, but the Chargers' execution was not. And it's fitting that it was their run defense that was their undoing in this game, because it was their run defense all season long that cost them. So I do want to jump back into the media's involvement in this whole mess. If you're a fan and you emerge from this game believing it was the timeout that cost the Chargers, given the way it was covered, I don't blame you for that at all. You know, you'd really have to dig deeper to realize that this was a false narrative. But if it's your job to wake up the next day and go talk about this game or write about it, either way, and the one thing you focus on is this timeout when there were so many other fascinating elements you could have dwelled on, that's pretty disappointing, you know. And so many experts were even saying that Staley should be fired, you know. And I can't help but think that a big part of the reason why this got so overblown was because it was Staley who called the timeout. You know, had it been another coach, I don't think it would have had the same kind of media impact. And the reason for that is because, you know, Staley has a new school approach. He believes in the analytics of the game. And this threatens, you know, some of these conventional thinkers, you know, especially ex-ball players who played the game in a different era. And, you know, they don't like to see this change, you know, and so they have this natural bias against them. And in this instance, I think it was old school thinkers believing they had an opportunity to tear down a new school approach, taking the ball and running with it without properly analyzing the situation first. All right, that covers it. I rest my case. I'd love to hear, do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think of my assessment? Please feel free to comment below. We've seen 8 playoff games thus far. I can't wait for the 2 later on today. It's going to be exciting. Next week, we're going to dive into a few of the scenarios that have occurred through the first 10 games of the playoffs. Excited to bring you that. But until then, there's only one thing left to say, and that is enjoy the games later on today.